Hello, team, and welcome back to ATP Geopolitics with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War news update for the 20th of July 2023. This is part two. Before I go into where I normally start in part two, which is the Frontline update, I just want to bring this to your attention. It's just come out now. So this is referring to that strike on Stary Krim in occupied Crimea, where they had to evacuate 2,000 people, and it was cooking off a day. It was just huge amounts of ammunition going off, and there was, as I said this morning or earlier today, there was a talk that it was the biggest sort of ammunition depot in Crimea. I don't know. This is a comparative satellite imagery that has come out just now. I don't know where the ammunition was, whether the ammunition was at a slightly different position to this, but this looks like a normal military base with, I guess, um, are they barracks there? I don't really know. Uh, but nonetheless, you can see the devastation that has taken place here as most of that base is wiped out. You wonder whether that was uh, full of troops, personnel there. Was that where all the ammunition was? Anyway, it's looking a little bit worse for wear. Right, let's move on to the front line, and we're going to go. Well, first thing to say is that information coming out of the front line has been pretty thin on the ground. There's a lot of operational security going on, particularly along the south, and that's still the case today. Had very little news out of the south yesterday. Appears to be very little news at the moment. I don't know whether that'll change. I'll have a look as I prepare for my frontline update. But at the moment, there's a few things to remark on. This is Shashank Joshi of The Economist, the defense correspondent there, referring to a Financial Times article actually that quotes from a chap from the 78th Regiment Special Forces. Says we can push with 10 brigades, but it won't work because the mines are everywhere. Every half a meter there are mines. This I was trying to emphasize yesterday in my frontline update how significant these minefields are. I showed you a mine roller going through a field, and it exploded one anti-tank mine and then six anti-personnel mines in 6 meters. That's what I could work out. Literally, that's an anti-tank, anti-personnel mine every meter. So you are trying to move across these fields either on foot or by vehicle, and you are going to, it's just so difficult. Every field, and there are thousands of fields horizontally and then vertically, on this axis and on that axis. You just have to clear a load. Okay, if you're only going to puncture in a couple of places, then you want to clear a narrow pathway. The problem is that, as I've already said today, you are going to be telling the opposition exactly where you're going to be driving, and all your forces are going to go through that. It becomes a pinch point. So it's just really difficult, I think, to commit to a quick counteroffensive. Is just not going to happen. Continuing, Lee said that the soldiers could benefit from anti-personnel obstacle breaching systems, a mobile explosive line charge system used to clear mines from a safe distance. These can fit into a backpack and can be carried on foot. That's almost like a Miklik, a personal Miklik, just throwing out some explosives. Actually, there's more footage of a Miklik that came out today doing its stuff on the front somewhere. Now, to go to the front near Kupiansk, this is up at the very north of the front line. Russians keep pushing from Mazyativka south through the forest strip and towards Sinkivka. Contrary to some Russian sources, there is heavy fighting north and west of Sinkivka. So Sinkivka is here. That's just in the grey zone and or going on towards Ukrainian control. And there is fighting there, not to the south of Sinkivka, as no report says, but to the north and to the west. So the Russians are still pressuring up in that neck of the woods. Right. Syrsky says Russian forces in Bakhmut are semi-encircled. This is where the Ukrainians are having most of their success, I think. Russian forces in Bakhmut have been semi-encircled as Ukraine created conditions to retake the city, Colonel General Syrsky told the BBC on July the 20th, so that's today. Quote, at the moment, the deployment of Russian troops resembles an arch concentrated in Bakhmut. They are under semi-encirclement. Well, it's impossible not to take advantage of that, the commander of the Ukrainian forces in the east said in the interview. I think that's fairly significant and an admission that I think the Ukrainians are quite buoyed up in that area. They're quite confident that things are going fairly well. Ukrainian forces took over the entire ground and its fortifications south of Bakhmut and have entered parts of Klishchivka village. This is something that we had thought had happened, or possibly had happened to some degree, 2 or 3 days ago, and then it seems that there was some fierce fighting back from the Russians in Klishchivka, as there is pretty much everywhere. But it seems that the Ukrainians have got the advantage again coming into Klishchivka. I was wondering whether they would fight through the town or just make it untenable for the Russians to remain there. Second Battalion, Assault Battalion, has cleared the positions of the 72nd Brigade. So these are the guys who infamously sort of ran away from the canal area to the south, around Klishchivka, actually to the west of Klishchivka, and they were berated by Wagner for doing so. Here we have extensive footage showing an operation that lasted more than 12 hours. As a result, the Russians were pushed back 1,800 meters. That's almost 2 kilometers. That's fairly significant for a single operation. Very significant. So that's really good for the Ukrainians there. Elsewhere, though, there's just not a lot of information. The only thing to note really is, as Nell report says here, Vasilivka, Velika Novosilka, Kremina. There are no updates. More footage emerged from the failed Russian attack on Krasnohorivka. I think I did call someone out on this actually for reporting that it was a repelled attack at the time, and it was a pro-Ukrainian source. It might have even been one of the sources I normally use. Was saying the Krasnohorivka attack was a repelled attack, and then showed video footage of the Ukrainians shelling the mine. I was like, it can't be a repelled attack if they've successfully taken the mine, and you're showing us that the Ukrainians are shelling the Russians there. They're not repelled, they are literally there. They have taken the mine and it has cost them dearly. But let's not like pretend things have happened that haven't happened. That was, and it's quite interesting because the general staff line was a repelled attack. So we need to be careful that the Ukrainian general staff are going to be spinning things in their favor, and they're not going to be presenting things like, they're not going to say that Krasnohorivka was, or the mine by Krasnohorivka was taken by the Russians. They're going to say we repelled an attack there. Now, what has happened subsequently is they have repelled the Russians. So, or at least that is the claim. So the Russians were at the mine, and then, as I was expecting, the Ukrainians just absolutely hammered the mine, and probably with JDAMs as well. And that made it untenable for the Russians to remain there, and they have pulled back, possibly. I mean, this is what no reports are saying. More footage emerged from a failed Russian attack on Krasnohorivka. I mean, it was failed. I don't think it was failed. The attack. See, again, I have an issue with that. I don't think it was failed. Depends how you evaluate that. I think they lost a lot, and it was kind of a kind of Pyrrhic victory. So they took that. Whoop-de-doo, you've got a mine with a few people, but you've lost, what, I don't know, a dozen pieces of equipment out there, and you've lost half your troops taking this, and now you're getting hammered here. So I don't know that it was a failed attack at that point, but it is now a failed attack, I suppose, or at least the whole operation is a failure because they've had to retreat from there, if that is indeed true. So Russian claim they control the mine, but hours after, infantry fled the mine area after coming under heavy fire. So this is an admission that it wasn't an initially repelled attack. And actually, no reports was claiming it was a repelled attack. So we just need to be careful. I'm all about accuracy. I'm pro-Ukrainian, but let's be accurate. Okay, so moving on to military aid, because actually there's just not a lot of information coming out, as I've said. A big US aid package has been promised to bolster Ukraine's air defense in the long term. So this is supposedly worth 1.3 billion, but this looks like the same aid package as here for 400 million. So I don't really know what's going on. For a National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, or Norwegian, depending on where you're from, it's a co-production between the US and Norway, and munitions. So NASAMS is a really capable piece of kit. I don't know if it can take out ballistic missiles though. 152 mil artillery rounds, mine clearing equipment, tow missiles for the tube launched optically tracked wire guided missiles on top of the Bradleys, Phoenix Ghost and Switchblade unmanned aerial systems, so drones. Those are loitering munitions, precision aerial munitions, counter drone and electronic warfare detection equipment. Now, this is really important. 150 fuel trucks, 115 tactical vehicles to tow and haul equipment, 50 tactical vehicles to recover equipment. So these are 50 ARVs, armored recovery vehicles. The 8, 9, and 10 there are massively, I mean, it's all significant, right? But this is where the Ukrainians are going to continue to have an advantage over the Russians. Not only is it their territory and they are inside the arch. So if you think about a semicircle of the front line, they can move from one part of the front line more easily to another because it's inside that circle, whereas the Russians have to go right around the outside. And that makes their logistical maneuvers more difficult and more demanding, and they have fewer trucks as well. They started the war with only, what was it? I don't know, what was the claim that you would need something like 100,000 trucks to do what Russia were doing, or at least America have in their inventory 100,000 trucks for logistics, and the Russians at the time had 4,000 trucks, and that's because they're a railway army. But Ukraine had destroyed their ability to use railway at that time inside Ukraine, so they're having to use the trucks. The trucks are getting stuck in the mud and breaking down because they hadn't maintained them for decades, and it was all a bit of a nightmare. And they had a logistical nightmare because they're just not a truck nation, and they won't now be a truck nation. A year and a bit later, it's not like they've suddenly made 95,000 trucks, right? We've seen them try to use commercial trucking to get certain things from A to B, whereas Ukraine have an easier logistical uh, situation, and they're being provided many more pieces of kit to do those logistical maneuvers than the Russians. Port and harbor security equipment, tactical secure, I don't know what, tactical secure communication systems, so things like Starlink. I don't know whether it's definitely that you hear claims that Starlink's good, and then you hear claims that actually Starlink isn't quite as good. I don't know whether that's changed, whether the Russians have done some counter measures towards Starlink, or I don't know. You just hear a few bits and pieces, and actually there are other systems that are being used as well. Uh, but certainly, earlier on in the war, Starlink was all that and a bag of chips. Support for training, maintenance, and sustainment activities. And then when you see this announcement, US will announce an additional $400 million package to Ukraine in a few days, CNN writes. It will include munitions for Nazans, missiles for Patriot and HIMARS. It will also include artillery shells, javelin, and tow anti-tank systems. So it seems like there's a bit of a crossover between these two announcements, and I'm not sure what's going on there, whether these are two announcements or a misreporting of one announcement. I don't know, but either way, that's really great stuff. So far, 10 of the MiG-29s that have been handed over from Poland. So Poland had a bunch of MiG-29s that they were still kind of using or mothballing some of them. They've given 10. Those are being used. They've got another 20 or maybe 19. I thought they had 29 to begin with. But either way, they've got about 20 left, which are still in service, said the Ukrainian ambassador to Poland in an interview. So it's possible that they will hand over those remaining 20. That was with Slovakia, who handed over some themselves. The EU will increase military support for Ukraine in response to the decision of the Russian Federation to attack ships in the Black Sea. I find this quite, yeah, it's quite an interesting situation whereby, and I said yesterday and previously that it's a bit of a like the Putin paradox type thing. The better Ukraine do, the more vehemently Russia react. Okay, so Ukraine hit the Kerch Bridge, and that's really good. And everyone's going, "Yeah, awesome, take that, Russia!" And then Russia absolutely hammer Ukraine. They hammer Odessa. They hammer Mykolaiv. They hammer their ability to export grain. They close off the grain deal. And actually, you're thinking, "Oh goodness me, was it worth doing that?" type thing. And then the EU come back and say, "Right, now that you've done that," and you just got this ratcheting up. And I just don't think in all of this ratcheting up that Russia can win that. I mean, NATO's combined abilities in terms of stocks and money and economies compared to Russia, the only thing Russia can do to stop that ratcheting up and win is kind of nuclear missiles, and that ain't going to happen. So, yeah, it's good to see the EU saying we're going to increase military support in response to uh, the Black Sea situation. In July, Lithuania will provide Ukraine with military aid and weapons worth 24 million euros. This was announced by the defense minister of Lithuania at the virtual Ramstein meeting. For our part, we propose to create a coalition of wisdom because such a six-state mini coalition is already working in Lithuania, training Ukrainian education specialists. This is really good. I think it's all about specializing. I said this before, but you guys work on humanitarian stuff. You guys are neutral, so you're not going to give military stuff anyway. How about some demining equipment? We'll do the big military stuff. And Lithuania and other nations, yeah, they are providing military stuff, but they're also getting together with others to work on um, yeah, internet, cyber warfare stuff. Here, they're mentioning education, so it's really important that you're covering all the bases with everybody's specialisms. Um, Lithuania launches a launches a crowdfunding campaign to purchase 500 drones. That is drone songs, or I'm not going to pronounce that, was launched in Lithuania to collect 300,000 euros to purchase 500 first-person view K drones, according to Delphi News. A campaign initiated by the organisation Madzi Bet Stiprus, small but strong, kicked off on July 19th and will run until Ukraine's Independence Day on August 24th. That's awesome. And Ireland will allocate, and I did report this yesterday, but just to kind of reiterate this, because Leo Varadkar was in Ukraine yesterday. 5 million euros in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. 3 million euros will be used in Ukraine by the Red Cross for its vital work, and 2 million goes to the UN fund, said the Prime Minister of Ireland, Taoiseach. Next week, Spain will hand over 4 refurbished Leopard 2A4 tanks. These are ones that they had promised, but they've now refurbished them. 10 APCs, probably M113s, and several armoured SUVs, light trucks, ambulances, and a field hospital. I think the field hospital might already be there. I'm sure I've seen that as delivered, but I'm not sure. Additional shipments of light weapons and heavy caliber ammunition were also announced, as Spain stepping up a little bit there as well. Good stuff. Now, I showed you a Chieftain main battle tank being upgraded, and that was quite surprising because it's a fairly old tank. It's come from Jordan. There's a talk about, well, there are a load of the Challenger ones there that would be fantastic if Jordan could get them over. I don't know how many. There are talks about, several hundred or whatever. I was speaking to a tank commander friend yesterday who said, yeah, there's probably about 60 or so, whatever. They need to go over there. Anyway, the same guy who was showing you that main battle tank, that Chieftain, Ukrainian volunteer Roman Bochkala, reports that various types of Western weapons are waiting for Ukrainian defenders. First of all, tanks, armored vehicles, armored personnel carriers, various tractors and engineering vehicles. Presumably, all this equipment was purchased from genuine collectors, and after repair will go to the armed forces of Ukraine. So this is fantastic. This is again what Ukraine are getting that Russia aren't, which is private collectors and arms dealers, if you like, and even people who weren't arms dealers who become there's that guy in Northamptonshire in the UK that I talked about previously, who was saying that hey, I've got a farm and I collected this stuff and I had all this stuff here, and then all of a sudden the Ukrainians wanted it and I've accidentally become an arms dealer. It's just amazing. Yeah, accidentally become an arms dealer. He's now shipping out lots of stuff like this that he's had previously for his own kind of interests, and now they've got a use, and they're shipping out to Ukraine after getting a little bit of TLC. So here we've just got plenty of kit that's coming. One would presume from a number of different sources, private collectors here, there, and everywhere. And this is all Leyland Daff, old school. Yeah, this is getting shipped out probably to, or either getting upgraded where they are or shipped out and getting upgraded in Ukraine or nearby. This is absolutely fantastic. So this is again, here he is walking around, just walking past all these. I don't know if those are British. A lot of those, I think those ones just behind him there. Someone could probably correct me. They might be like one of the S class, like Saxon. They all begin with S. But lots of kit out there that looks, almost ready to go. Some of it needs a little bit of a lick of paint. That just adds to the Ukrainian ability to commit to this war and get it done. On the other hand, there is, well, first of all, this is interesting footage of Chief Wizard in Russia putting spells on some of these main battle tanks. Now, these are these T90s. The question is Russia actually producing? They are producing tanks, right? The question is, how many are they producing every month, and what does this represent? Uh, and exactly what will that water do? But anyway, the Russians are getting tanks. Here's a what looks like a brand spanking new T90M with ERA on it, explosive reactive armor on the back. Again, how many do they have? What is this telling us? Someone's saying that T90s are glorified T72s. Yeah, but they're going to be useful tanks for the Russians, of course. This chap saying I counted at least 14 on the train. I presume that was that train footage we just saw. That this one is on, but could not tell if some were new T80s. But most Russian vehicles come from conservation after repairs and look like this. And I showed you that footage yesterday. So uh, yeah, I don't know how many, exactly what type of tanks they are, and where they're going, and when the footage was taken. But certainly, it's not like Russia can't produce any vehicles at all. It's just, can they produce anywhere near the levels that they are using? How many tanks and vehicles they have in stock that can be used, and how long can those stocks last, etc., etc. And then we have more footage here. I don't quite know what's going on here. You just got a bunch of these stacked in a field. Uh, Goodness knows when this was from, and again, what it signifies. But there are Russian T90Ms and T90Ss. Those are the T90Ss are the export versions, particularly you see going to places like India. Anyway, that's the military aid section. We'll move on to the geopolitical section now, which there's an awful lot to say in this section. Right, the West did everything. This is what Putin said. The West did everything to derail the grain deal. They spared no effort. It is the Russian Federation that makes a colossal contribution to global food security. Really? Really, Putin? Do you expect me to believe that? It's just absolute nonsense. It's just he's he's vomiting lies here. Uh, Quote from Putin: Russia will replace Ukrainian grain in the food market. I mean, let's go back to what he said. We've done everything. For example, stopping the grain deal, blowing up grain storage units, stopping a port from working, stopping a port from getting electricity, which also stops the port from working. Not only the physical cranes and stuff, but the power there. They can't now get this food. First of all, I've blown up 60,000 tons of grain. Second of all, I'm stopping the grain getting exported, physically put onto boats. The third of all, I've stopped boats coming into the Black Sea to take it away. Fourth of all, I've whacked a load of mines there to stop the boats from safely having passage. But do you know what? It's the Russian Federation that makes a colossal contribution to global food security. I call you out, Putin. I smell a rat there. And do you know what? The rat is you. You are the rat. Right, Russia, and then it all makes sense here. Russia will replace the Ukrainian grain in the food market. I see what you've done. You've blown up Ukraine's ability to export grain, and you're going to say, right, oh, we've got a load of grain. We're a massive grain producer. We can probably do that. Russia will replace Ukrainian grain in the food market. Russia will consider the possibility of returning to the grain deal if the ammonia pipeline between Togliatti and Odessa is resumed. In other words, we want ammonia to go through Ukraine to Russia. we demand Ukraine sell us ammonia or supply us with ammonia to make fertilizers. We demand that because, oh, by the way, we've also invaded you. Ugh. Stay on target, Pierce. The Russian Federation will attack all ships that will move in the direction of Ukrainian ports, says the Russian MOD. Russia will consider such ships as participants in the war on the side of Kyiv. Just. Russia may attack civilian ships in the Black Sea and blame Ukraine, the US warns. Warning comes after Moscow says all ships sailing to Ukrainian ports could be seen as involved in the conflict after it pulled out of the UN-backed grain deal. Just absolutely nuts, this. Again, Russia. Let's just quickly dip into this. This is National Security Council spokesman Adam Hodge. The Russian military may expand their targeting of Ukrainian grain facilities to include attacks against civilian shipping. He said the allegation was based on newly declassified intelligence. And this is something the Americans have done, particularly in this conflict, right? They have, and this has been the case since actually just before the war began. They declassified a load of intelligence, putting it out in the open to make things transparent and make people understand exactly what's going on. This is not something the US is used to doing, or any nation really. It's like your military intelligence actually putting it out into open source basically and saying, "Have at it, guys. This is what's going on," and that helps to inform the kind of the information space. It helps to build up a narrative, doesn't it? It came in the wake of a missile and drone attack by Russia against the port of Odessa, and after the Kremlin pulled out of an international deal allowing safe passage of massive Ukrainian grain exports across the Black Sea and to the world markets. Moscow said its missiles targeted military objectives in Odessa. That is demonstrably false. We've seen the footage. There's so much footage of destroyed port stuff, of blown up grain storage units. Putin is lying. Russian shills and pro-Kremlin voices on this thread, stop supporting this outright liar and morally abhorrent war criminal. Just stop doing it. And while you're at it, wind your own necks in. Right. Then it's all about, well, what do we do? How do we get around this? We as a global food eating accumulation of civilizations. Regional head of Odessa has just issued an update saying 8 people were injured due to a night attack. The number has doubled, mainly due to 3 firefighters needing treatment for poisoning by combustion products and other shrapnel wounds. And there's that footage. We've got plenty of footage that, hey, these aren't military targets. And then there's a really good point here. NATO appeasing Russia. It's possible to get from NATO member Turkey's shores or ports to Romania's and even Odessa without entering international waters. Thus, they have the right to protect traffic there. Turkey has reneged on such a promise. So this is the idea. Well, what happens? Can we escort ships? Why isn't NATO protecting its own shores? It is possible to sail from Turkey to Odessa without entering international waters, which Russia has no right to control anyway. This is pure terrorism. And yeah, all the way up the side, into Ukrainian waters, get some grain, come all the way back. Russia, you have no right to attack ships in those areas. You just don't have the right, let alone in international waters anyway. China was the largest buyer of agricultural products that went through the grain corridor. In yesterday's strike, Russia destroyed 60,000 tons of agricultural products destined for China. And that came from yesterday, so actually 2 days ago's strike. They probably destroyed even more tonnage now. So I don't think that's a good move for Russia because China might get just a little bit annoyed. Now, talking about moving on to other geopolitical things, China is complicit in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, says the MI6 chief. Now, he's come and done, Politico organised this conference, and the MI6 chief, who's been in place since 2020, Sir Richard Moore, had a bit to say about China. Shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine, Xi and Vladimir Putin signed a no-limits partnership between their countries. After the war began, China's government sought to present itself as a neutral peacemaker, and there have been signs of Xi's dissatisfaction with events. Now, I'm sure this grain deal isn't going to help, actually, but in practice, Beijing refused to publicly censure or discourage Russia, and senior officials often expressed direct support. Quote, when Putin invaded Ukraine, the Chinese very clearly supported the Russians, Moore said. They have completely supported the Russians diplomatically. They've abstained in key votes at the UN. They've absolutely cynically repeated all the Russian tropes, particularly in places like Africa and Latin America, by blaming NATO and all of this stuff. Moore said MI6 now devoted more resources to China than any other mission, which reflects China's importance in the world and the crucial need to understand both the intent and capability of the Chinese government. And this is where the US is at as well. They recognize that China is still the big threat. Like Russia is a huge threat, but it ain't the biggest one in terms of what it can possibly actually achieve and do. Whereas China have far greater economic, military capabilities than Russia. Of course, his comments are likely to spark an angry response from China. A few other things. You don't have a group of mercenaries advance up the motorway towards Moscow and get to within 125 kilometers of Moscow unless you have not quite predicted what was going to happen. He said Prigozhin was his creature, utterly created by Putin, and yet he turned on him. Moore said Putin didn't fight back but used allied Belarus to cut a deal. The Wagner group leader's specific whereabouts have not been clear since he marched his troops against Putin. It says Prigozhin, quote, this is from Moore as well. Prigozhin started off that day as a traitor at breakfast. He had been, as a traitor at breakfast, he had been pardoned by supper, and then a few days later, he was invited for tea. That's incredible. He's a traitor at breakfast, pardoned by supper, and a few days later, he's invited for tea because he went to see Putin 5 days later, didn't he? So there are some things that even the chief of MI6 finds a little bit difficult to try and interpret in terms of who's in and who's out. People are still trying to interpret the whole Prigozhin thing, right? Kiev Independence says that 5 European countries are to ask for extended EU ban on Ukrainian grain. So because or partly because there's this glut of grain right on the doors of the EU, if you flood the markets in the EU with cheap grain, then that will do the indigenous kind of European farmers a disservice, right? They're going to be losing their livelihoods. Cheap grain will mean that obviously they're going to make losses, and to protect their own. Although these nations, I mean Poland, Bulgaria, these nations are really supportive of Ukraine, but they're also caught in a bind because they obviously need to be supportive of their own population, right, and their own farmers. So there's this tension between wanting to have free trade with Ukraine to help Ukraine, even though they're not part of EU, but on the other hand, protect their own farmers, and that means restricting Ukrainian grain imports. And this is going against EU policy, but that's the tension between working for towards the ends of the EU and working towards your own political ends for your own country. So they're seeking to extend that ban on Ukrainian grain past, I think they have got so five nations will jointly ask the EU on July the 19th to prolong it past September the 15th. So it already exists to September the 15th. Agents of the Russian Federation who plan to blow up trains with aid to Ukraine were exposed in Poland, says Gazeta Polska. The agency network was relatively new. It was created at the beginning of 2023. So there have been these attempts to find out. You've got people in Poland doing reconnaissance on where the and what the military aid is, where it's coming in, and where it's going into Ukraine. There have been cameras that have been found on roads and near railway tracks that are keeping an eye on the aid that allied nations are given to Ukraine. And now there's possible ability to blow up trains with that aid on and Russian activity there. So that's significant. The US may soon impose secondary sanctions on Kyrgyzstan for helping Russia procure sensitive technologies for its war effort in Ukraine. The Washington Post reported Wednesday, citing 2 anonymous US officials familiar with the matter. This is super important. There are loopholes, and the loopholes generally around the Caucasus and these stan nations around the south of Russia, the Russian Federation. They are, but was it Georgia? Was it Georgia? Was it somewhere else? Where they're saying if you've had a car stolen in the last couple of years or whatever, it's likely here and it's going to Russia. And then all these car sales that are taking place and all this stuff going into Russia. These nations are kind of the conduit of things into Russia, full of technology that can be co-opted, right? And there are microchips there that can be adapted to use on weaponry. Australia has imposed sanctions against 35 organizations from the Russian Federation, says Andrei Yermak. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the country reported that it's about organizations in the fields of defense technology and energy sectors. Also, 10 individuals were sanctioned, including Russian ministers and high ranking officials, as well as military personnel from Belarus. Good on you, mate. Good on you, Australia, even though you're going to lose the test match, I hope. Famous last words. Trump vows to make Europe pay for US Ukraine aid if re-elected. Oh, come on, Trump! Just stop putting a division between the US and Europe at the moment, or do this under the radar. Like, if you're going to say stuff like this, say it to people directly. Don't cause a rift. This is really counterproductive, and this actually genuinely annoys me. US presidential candidate Donald Trump said on July the 18th that if elected, he will ask Europe to cover the US costs of restoring stockpiles of weapons sent to Ukraine. And it's not understanding I mean, I've talked about this ad nauseum. This is in the US's grand strategic interests and arguably in their financial interests as well and economic interests as stimulus. This is, I think he's just reading headlines and tweets of Elon Musk or whatever and then making up his mind. Just be better than that. Be better than that. Right, PM of Ireland, Leah Varadkar, was in Kyiv yesterday on an unannounced visit. We will hold negotiations on the topics of security, political cooperation, justice for Ukraine, and economic cooperation. Ireland is a neutral country, but that doesn't mean indifference. So where they will hopefully aid is in terms of humanitarian reconstruction, stuff like that. However, although they gave 5.6 million yesterday, that's not a massive amount. So it'd be nice if Ireland can. It'd be interesting to see what Irish people. I know I've got a number of you in my viewership, so it'd be interesting to see what you think. Vladimir Putin will not go to the BRICS summit in South Africa. So this is massive news. I talked about how Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, was kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. Didn't want Putin to come and wanted Lavrov to come, and then it looked like that was not going to happen, and possibly Putin was going to go and they'd have to arrest him because of the ICC arrest warrant on his head. Well, actually, this is a significant development. Don't underplay this. This is actually Ukraine. This is Russia, and this is Putin admitting that actually he doesn't have the power to go everywhere in the world, and he can't just stick two fingers up at international criminal court arrest warrants. He is beholden to international rules. This is really, really significant, I think. And finally, the IOC, so that's the Olympic Committee, International Olympic Committee, deprived Britain of the right to hold qualifying tournaments for breaking, breakdancing, skateboarding, sport climbing, and BMX freestyle for the 2024 Olympics due to discriminatory requirements for athletes from Russia and Belarus. This is to do with, so Britain, the British government required athletes from these countries to sign declarations of non-support for the war. So if you're a Russian athlete and you come in here, you're not standing up there and having a Z on your chest and going and being all pro-war, pro-Russia. You have to sign a non-support agreement for concerning the war. So the IOC said that such actions could put athletes in a difficult position when they return to Russia, which is an interesting point. But Britain was trying to be robust on that. IOC don't agree. IOC are much more kind of not quite appeasing, but they seem to just want Russia involved and Belarus, and actually UK are being quite strong there, but as a result, UK are being punished in terms of being able to hold certain events. So there you go. That's the news piece today, and that's a really, really long one. I'm really sorry that the second one was so long. Take care, and I may or may not be able to get a Frontline update out to you forthwith.